Hello and welcome to another Wednesday night of Mind to Mind. My name is Evelyn Jerry and I am a mental health advocate practitioner and I'm joined by my friend Dr. Daniel Claiborn. You want to say hi to people?
Yes. Hi, we're glad to be back. I really miss the show in between shows. I find myself really looking forward to the next one. So we do
Mhm.
these every other week, and we welcome your questions and also your ideas for future shows. Evelyn and I have a lot of ideas ourselves, but we
Yeah,
also really want to know what you out there watching are interested in. So,
yeah.
yes, and also, each show will have an outline or an article that
Mhm.
on the topic. So, if any of you would like to receive those, you can contact Evelyn or email me. Or if you have questions, emailing me is fine as well.
All right. This particular week, we're going to be discussing a hot topic. We've heard about it so many times, but I kind of feel like a lot of people have the wrong idea of what it means. And today we'll be discussing about toxic masculinity. And I would like Dr. Claiborne to start us off by telling us what toxic masculinity is.
Well, yes, I think it's really important to understand first that when you hear that phrase, some people misunderstand that it means that all masculinity is toxic just because it's
Mhm.
masculinity. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about traits that anyone can have, male or female, that, but some of them are, we think of them as more masculine, and some of them we think of as more feminine. But any of these traits, if we
Yeah.
use them in the wrong way or we use them in a too extreme form, then they become toxic. So it's not that
Mhm.
masculinity or femininity by themselves are toxic, but we just think of
Yeah.
some of these traits as masculine and some of them as feminine. And today we're going to talk about the ones that we think of as masculine and the ways in
Mhm.
which they can be harmful or toxic. Um, the other thing I wanted to mention too is as we talk about these traits, most traits we have in moderation or used with good judgment are not toxic. It's when they're
Mhm.
used in a way that's more harmful or more in a more of an extreme form that they can become
Mhm.
toxic. So as we talk about
Yeah.
these, you may think of some of them as actually good things. Well, in
Mhm.
small quantities and used appropriately, they are good. But
Mhm.
if you, I hope you understand that if it's extreme or used too much or used to gain control over others, or that's when it becomes toxic.
Yeah. For sure, for sure. And I think it's really important for us to really understand what toxic masculinity is. And next week we will be discussing toxic femininity. And believe you me, it's nothing like what toxic masculinity is. I read the article, guys, and I am so shocked, and I think I am guilty of some of these traits. Yeah, let's
Oh,
wait
all of
until next week. So
yes, all of
not all of not
yeah,
all
all
of
of
them, but some of them, some of
yes, all of us have
them,
traits.
and it's basically I think kind of opposite of what toxic.
Yes, all of us have certain
Sorry.
toxic traits that we all of us have
Mm-hmm.
toxic traits that maybe we've learned from our parents or our family, or we've been influenced by role models of different kinds. And so we many times act in such a way that might be toxic to others, but we're not even necessarily aware of it until we get feedback.
Yeah, and some of
So,
you know what really triggered me was the fact that like I grew up thinking some of these things are normal,
uh-huh.
like they're normal, and I think like if we get into it, we'll just end up discussing about toxic femininity, guys. But today we're discussing about toxic masculinity. So stay tuned next week as we discuss about toxic femininity.
Uh-huh. And
So
actually,
about
Evelyn, now that you mention it, many of these traits we're going to be talking about are normal. That doesn't mean they're healthy, but they're everywhere. And so
mm-hmm,
they're normal in the sense that they're common, very common,
mm-hmm.
but not healthy. So
Yeah, for sure.
that's a good point. The other thing, maybe
Mm-hmm,
to start off with, is there are some traits that all of us sometimes have that are not masculine or feminine, but
mm-hmm,
they're definitely toxic. And some of the ones that I thought of were dishonesty,
mm-hmm.
hate, jealousy, selfishness, denial, when we're in denial,
Yeah.
paranoia, thinking of people as conspiring against us, or being obsessive. I mean, there are many others, but those are some things that are definitely toxic, and we try to stay away from them and correct them in ourselves, but they're not necessarily seen as feminine or masculine. So, but
Yeah.
today we're going to talk about the ones that are more perceived as more common with men and more likely to be thought of as
Mm-hmm.
masculine, even though women can do them.
Mm-hmm.
But okay,
Yeah.
so that's how we're framing it. And so Evelyn's provided an outline with some of these traits, and also some of the ones we call toxic femininity, which we'll talk about next week or 2 weeks from now. So if you have any
Mm-hmm.
questions between shows, please let us know, and we'll try to address that.
All right. And I think we should start by discussing now the outline on toxic masculinity. And I think one of the ones that resonated to a lot of people was the drive to dominate and win.
Hmm. Right. And
Yeah.
anybody can feel those feelings, that, to want to win, but this is one that if it's frequent or excessive, then that's what makes it become toxic. A little bit of competitive spirit, or enjoyment of winning, is good and normal and healthy. But sometimes in some of our public figures, our uh, political leaders or our military leaders, and sometimes you see this in sports, the
Mhm.
the need to dominate and win can be overwhelming. And that's one of the traits that we think of it more as a masculine trait, but it's can be toxic if done to an
Yeah.
extreme.
Yeah, and it's so sad that it's so I don't know, like I find that people find it normal, like it's so normalized that we think that every man should, like when a masculine
Yeah.
human being enters into a room, like we should all feel it, like it's like
Uh,
it's about them, what they want, and they feel like they have a right to interrupt whatever is going on in the room so that we can listen to them.
mhm.
And it means that whatever they want comes first above every single person in the room. And it also means that when it comes to rights, they have more rights than anyone else in the room. So any person who it doesn't matter whether something was going on without them, it doesn't matter whether people were in the middle of something, it doesn't matter. If they want to use something that you were using, they will just take it. Why? Because they feel like you need to, they are the man, they have to dominate everything and everybody in the room. And to be
In
honest,
our country, in the United States, there was some research on how often men interrupt women and how often women interrupt men. And men tend to
mhm,
interrupt women, at least in our studies, 5 times as often as women interrupt men. So it does seem to be a little bit associated with being male. The other thing about this winning is that
Yeah.
people who do this and feel strongly about it usually imagine that everyone else is operating the same way. So it's not like I need to
Yeah.
be careful of the feelings of the other person because they're trying to win and dominate too, which of
Yeah.
course isn't true. But sometimes the person trying to dominate just believes they're doing what everybody else is doing,
Yeah.
and that winning is all important. The other thing about this one's very important one is that somewhat it's related to Western culture.
Hmm.
By Western, I mean European and Christianity and Islam. And the Western cultures and Western religions focus a lot
Hmm.
more on the individual and the individual acting in his or her own best interests. Whereas the Eastern cultures, like in India and China and Japan and places like that, those cultures and those religions are more socially oriented. In other words, acting in the best interests of the group rather
Hmm.
than acting in the best interests of myself. And so there's
Yeah.
a kind of a religious and cultural polarity, kind of a difference between this emphasis on winning for myself individually, or do I act in such a way that benefits my group and my community?
Mhm.
So there's a little bit of background there culturally.
Yeah. Yeah. I think even that is that is really visible also in the African culture, especially when it comes to male dominance. You find when the man enters the room, when the man enters the room, you find that in some of our cultures where a woman or children are not supposed to intervene, and
Uh-huh. Yeah.
the woman is not supposed to be involved in a conversation that while men are talking as well, regardless of whether
Mhm.
she has a better idea or a solution to the problem. And other situation is that also like you are also not allowed in certain conversations. Then again, it doesn't matter what you were doing as a woman or a child, they will, once they enter the room, it means that you either need to discuss or give them space, give them room, like they can even dominate the entire living room. Like they should be
Mhm.
served food, they should be done this, like it means that you can't do certain things when they're around. And also it doesn't matter whether you're in the middle of an important conversation with either other female or even your children, and it is an important conversation, that all can end within a minute the moment he's in the room.
Well, and this
Yeah,
brings up a good
so
point.
quite honestly, I think it's visible in so many cultures.
Right. This brings up a good point as to whether something like that that's very gender related, is it toxic or isn't it? If it may be following the cultural norm, and so in that sense it's normal and expected, but is it toxic? I mean, does it really end up suppressing the party that's being interrupted or being talked over? So yeah, that is a very good point. Um, and sometimes that's also related to our families and how we were brought up. You might also find a difference too between urban populations and rural populations, with rural populations more following old traditions that they've seen for generations, but that may be very different from one gender to the other. And then in urban populations, even in that same country or the same culture, there's more of an equality and less likelihood of following those traditions. Another thing on our list too that's very different, and that is the idea that if you express yourself emotionally or you show your emotions, it's a sign of weakness. This is something a lot of men exhibit, and we might think of as masculine, even though women could do it too. But the idea that if we are emotionally expressive, it makes us look weak. And so we have to do everything we can not to seem weak or vulnerable. When actually, sometimes being vulnerable and open to help and being and leaning on others and is actually a healthy thing to do. I think Evelyn has left the meeting to rejoin us, maybe with some technical difficulties. But I'll go ahead, and when she comes back, she'll have some input and some questions about this too. Um, Another one on our outline is that this very strong need to control others, not to let them control us. Um, we tend to think of that as a masculine trait, but if it's done to the extreme, then it really is toxic. An example I use is when I consult with leaders of companies and they have meetings with their team. I encourage the leader of the team not to say what they think first, but to listen to the rest of the team initially, so that everyone gets a chance to be encouraged to speak and say what they think. Often in teams, if the leader says what he thinks or what she thinks initially, then many of the people on the team won't speak at all. They'll just shut down. And then the team doesn't have the benefit of hearing what everyone thinks. So, team leaders, especially charismatic or fairly powerful team leaders, it's really good policy for them to bring up an issue and then let everyone else on the team speak first. Otherwise, and also, as that happens, the leader of the team may think of, and here's some things that he or she hadn't thought of. And so when they finally get a chance to say what they think, then it's richer and more intelligent and more informed because they've listened to the other members of the team. What we did, Evelyn, we kind of went on with our outline a little bit, and we talked about emotional expression felt like it's a weakness, and then we
Mm-hmm.
went on to this need that we think of as toxic, the need to control others and to
Yeah.
always be in, and to look and not just be in control, but to look like one is in control,
Yeah.
not to seem shaky or vulnerable or indecisive, things like that.
Hmm. That's interesting. I'm sorry about that. I think there's something wrong with my network, but I'm glad to be back. I would like to hear more about the indecisiveness and how it's toxic.
Well, I guess in our culture anyway, um, men are raised to be decisive and goal oriented and determined, and
Mm-hmm.
to have goals and be pursuing their goals. And now more and more and more, I think that's becoming something that everyone is encouraged to do, girls and
Yeah.
boys alike. But historically, it's been a quality really expected of men, and some men take it to the extreme where they won't
Mm-hmm.
ask for help, they won't
Mm-hmm.
admit mistakes,
Yeah.
they won't uh, ask for assistance, and that's when it becomes toxic, not just to other people, but even to
Yeah.
themselves when
Mm-hmm.
they need help or they need input, but they can't ask for it or be
Yeah.
open. Have you ever known anyone, Evelyn, that's like that?
Yeah, of course. Yes, I have. And unfortunately, there's this need for men to be the solution finders whenever there's a problem, or they're just supposed to always be in the know of what to do, how to solve a problem, and all that. And
Uh-huh.
unfortunately, even when they are not able to, they will not communicate when they're not able to, and they will even choose silence instead of like saying they're not able to, or even seek help, like you said, so that we can all brainstorm and come up with a solution. And unfortunately, you will find that a lot of delay can occur sometimes to a detrimental sense, and something goes wrong just because they couldn't ask for help. Yeah, and at the end of the day, they might even end up like taking alcohol, and like resulting to
It's,
a
yes,
drug.
very stressful.
Yeah, cause they don't want to ask for help. They want to be the only ones in control. They should be strong, and come up with stuff all the time, and it's not possible. It's not feasible at all.
This is really an important point. Um, and when we talk about things being toxic, maybe we implied that it's toxic to other people, but it's also these things, if we overdo them, they're also toxic to the person doing it. And
Yeah.
I made a little list here, and let me read this list. These are all qualities, and when I read these, see if you identify that more with what men are expected to be like or what women are expected to be like.
Okay.
Independent, self-sufficient,
Mhm.
aggressive,
Mhm.
tough,
Mhm.
brave,
Mhm.
daring,
Mhm.
decisive,
Mhm.
and fearless. Well,
Yes.
I think most of those we would really expect men to be more like. But
Mm.
in our modern era, with the world so complex and
Mhm.
problems and issues so complicated, if you're too much this way, like Evelyn was saying, you won't ask for help and get
Mhm.
input, and then it's very toxic to the person himself, not
Yeah.
just to others, but yeah, the stress on that individual. And as Evelyn mentioned, then maybe that person turns to alcohol or drugs or other things to just kind of get out from under that burden. It's a big burden to try to be those qualities all the time.
Yeah. And you put in too much pressure within yourself that you can even get sick, you can get ulcers, you can get, like, because you feel, and to be honest, like, I think from a lot of conversations I've had from men is that, like, they are under so much pressure to perform, and most of that pressure, like, you'll find like 75% of that pressure doesn't come from external, the external, like, let's say, it doesn't come from other people, it comes from themselves. They feel like, oh, my dad achieved this by this age, they were working at this place, they had bought a house, they had a car, and also my brother is doing this and that. And I think it's just personal comparison from what you're doing and what other people your age or your family is doing.
Uh-huh.
Then you put in too much pressure within yourself, and
Hmm.
you yourself under too much stress to perform, which, to be honest, it's counterproductive, because you will not even be able to be productive enough, because you kind of have to free up your brain to be able to come up with solutions for some of your problems, or even to create. If you're a creative, you need to be sane, you need to be at peace, you need to be joyous, you need to feel good about yourself, so that you're able to create something. And
You
if you're
know,
not in space, and if you're not in that mind space, it's very hard for you to create something or come up with solutions for any problem.
right. That's right. It interferes with us being flexible and
Mhm.
creative. I was just thinking, Evelyn, as you were talking, we have four children, two, and they're all adults. Two are boys and two are girls. Two are men, two are women. And in our case, the two daughters feel just as much of this pressure to be decisive and productive and smart, and
Mhm.
as the sons do. And so
Yeah.
this is something, it may have been thought of as masculine
Hmm.
in the beginning, or maybe it was characteristic more of men traditionally and historically. But at least in our culture here, I have many women that I know that feel these very same pressures. That
Yeah.
it's not just that something men feel, and
Yeah.
And I think
It's
in
so
our country too, there are, in the last generation, almost all our families have two incomes, two
mm,
breadwinners, two people that are out there trying to create for their family. And so I think that's part of it. So it's shared equally by men and women now here.
yeah, and it's so sad. It's still happening here, and I think a lot of us, especially like the millennials, we are transitioning into that kind of world here in Kenya, and you find like a lot of us are in are expected to have a 50-50 relationship, but unfortunately, like it doesn't also translate to gender roles as well. So as much as you're contributing financially like 50-50, you'll find that the gender roles haven't really changed. So you'll find that the woman is still expected to cook, clean, and like do your laundry and everything, but at the same time they go to work and everything else
Hmm.
without any kind of help, and that is also too much pressure for the women. And
Hmm.
also like they need, like there's the pressure to also balance, am I good wife, am I good mother, at the same time I also have to be my best at work and all that. And then again, I am not allowed to be feminine or even be emotional in any way. If I have pressure at work, I can't come and bring it at home. Or if I am a boss at work, I have to come home and be a wife, like be submissive and be nice and all that. And even if I had a bad day, I'm not supposed to come. And of course, that is too much pressure. It is too much pressure.
Yeah, the research in our country shows that that's exactly true. I can't remember the exact statistics, but definitely with both spouses who are working, the woman still is then expected to do 60 or 80% of the household
Mm-hmm.
duties at home. And that isn't necessarily related to something that's toxic, like some of these traits we're talking about, but it's kind of a
Yeah.
situation that has developed that
Yeah.
is not equal for the two genders. So
Yeah.
maybe another topic for some time we might want to talk about is just gender expectations of men and women. That would be an interesting topic to, like,
Yeah.
culturally or historically or in our particular society, what are men expected to do and what are women expected to do?
Yeah,
And
and how it has evolved over the years. That's
yes,
an amazing topic, and
right.
I think that will be our next topic after the toxic femininity. Yeah, that's definitely a tick.
Uh-huh.
There's, there's a tick on that one, and I like the fact that we come up with topics as we continue to discuss, because I
Mhm.
think when it comes to mental well-being, there are a lot of topics that affect us as human beings, and that is what the holistic well-being with Evelyn
Well,
Zeri is all about.
and as you're mentioning, all the topics we talk about really, in some ways, are related to each
Yeah, they
other.
are.
They're not disconnected. They kind of
Mhm.
operate together, and
Yeah,
we're affected by all of them more or less. And
yeah,
so, yes, they interact with each other. We talk about toxic traits today, but then another time we may talk about how do we protect ourselves, how do we
yeah,
get life balance, these
yeah,
things we know that are good for us, and but how
yeah.
do we maintain them? And so we'll definitely get into those.
Yeah, and you do remember, like in our previous conversations, we discussed about the importance of communicating and healthy fighting. And I'm
Oh,
sure like this is also intertwined, because when we're discussing about someone feeling so much pressure from gender roles, it
mhm.
means that one of them did not communicate how they're feeling and the kind of pressure they're going through. If it is the man and they're going through a lot of pressure to perform, to provide and all that, and they're not able to because some a deal didn't go well here and there, and they're absolutely stressed about it, you should be able to communicate to your partner about such things. Or if you're in a family setup, like communicate with your family, because if you put such pressure to yourself, it doesn't only affect your work, it also affects the people around you. And it is
Uh-huh.
really, really important to communicate how you feel and what you're going through. And we all have good days, good seasons, bad seasons, and it's all a matter of coexisting together.
I think, this is a really good point you're bringing up, Evelyn. In relationships that are built on love, or even relationships that are built on employment, either one, the people involved, if they are having issues and stresses and bad feelings, or they tend not to bring them up because it
Yeah.
might uh, destroy the love feelings or the loyalty at work. But
Hmm.
they're the very kinds of things that should be brought up and
Yeah.
openly communicated, discussed with our partner or our employer. Um, but I think that especially in love relationships, and especially early in those relationships, when feelings like this come up, the person having the feelings tends not to bring it up and to just try to deal with it herself or himself. And when it's the opposite of what we really should do,
Yeah.
communication. We'll be coming back to that over and over again in our programs, the importance of honesty and being direct, being
Hmm.
open, having good communication.
Yeah.
Good. So that's a really good point.
Yeah. And don't you think, I think there's a point that you spoke about, like one of the toxic traits that everyone has, like both male and female, you said is the need to be self-reliant, independent. And don't you think those come out in this particular situation where you find that the reason as to why they don't want to communicate that they're having a struggle with whatever is going on is because they need the other person to view them as self reliant and independent, and they do not want to change how these people view them. Like it's more about how the rest of the world view them, and they do not want to be perceived as weak. If they communicate their emotions, they will be perceived as weak according to them, and maybe that's why they're not communicating.
I think of this as a toxic masculine trait, even though
Yes.
women do it now, because
Yeah.
historically, probably for thousands of years, women were very much open to sharing
Mm-hmm.
and the community around them and and helping others and getting help themselves. But I think as in our modern world, as women enter the workforce and the modern culture we have, they have actually fallen prey to this idea of being decisive and self-reliant and that they've actually kind of, it's almost like a disease, and they've caught this disease. But
Mm-hmm.
originally, I think it was associated more with men and being masculine, and women, I think historically, from primitive times, have been the ones that kind of create the community, create the family, help each other, and that helping and receiving help for women traditionally has not been perceived as negative. But for
Yeah.
men, it has been in some
Yeah.
ways, or in an extreme way at times. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Another one on my list that's related to this is that some uh, people see being cooperative or accommodating as a form of weakness, that I must
Yeah.
be my own person. And that we
Mm-hmm.
kind of associate with masculinity, although anyone could do it. But the idea that if I accommodate or I step back and allow someone else to have their way, or I, cooperate and compromise, that's somehow a form of weakness. We see this a lot nowadays with our politicians, where to all of the rest of us, a compromise seems to be what they should do, and they
Yeah.
resist it. They feel like it's giving up or giving in to the other
Mm-hmm.
person. And so we're seeing that right now in the United States in many different ways with our Congress, that there are certain issues on which people should compromise, but
Yeah.
there's this, and most of the Congress people are men, and so there's strong resistance to compromising. They're pushing to win instead
Mm-hmm.
of compromising. It just, for most citizens, it drives us crazy because we wish they would just compromise and get on with it.
Yeah, and they actually end up turning the situation about them. They make it about their ego instead of what they were put in that seat to do. Because you, as a leader, a representation of the people, and you are there to discuss about the people's needs and their wants, and like, you're there to have a discussion on, we have a problem here, we need to solve it like this.
Uh,
So if you decided that this is how we need to solve it, someone else comes and tells you that this is not feasible because of this and this. Instead of hearing what they're saying, they will turn the situation about their ego, and they need to be right, they need to win, they need to have their way, and they forget the main reason as to why you're in that seat is to fight for the needs of the people.
this is one of your best ideas, Evelyn, because we see that in our country, definitely. And I think part of it is that the power structure in our country is based on elections. And
Mhm.
so a person gets elected to office and they can be there 2 years or 4 years, but they have to be reelected, reelected, reelected. So they begin to be more interested in retaining power than in
Mhm.
solving problems. It
Yes.
should be the way, Evelyn, that you just described it, that
Yes.
they're elected to solve issues and problems and not to stay in power. But it turns
Yeah.
out that staying in power becomes the overriding concern as opposed to solving the problems. Right now, as we speak, our House of Representatives in our country is on
Mhm.
the verge of shutting down the government and
Wow.
and not and cutting all the federal employees off from salaries just based on principles that they're fighting about, right? As
Wow.
opposed to what the effect of this might be if it happens on all the thousands of employees that depend on these incomes. So yes, that's really
Unfortunately,
right.
Unfortunately, that's the same thing with our politics here in Kenya. I think politicians are they just cut off from the same cloth, because you will find that what happens in our parliament, you'll find that most of the time you you will find that they will support another politician's agenda because they need a favor from these people to push one of their agendas. So you'll
Mm.
find that if it's coming from a higher politician, a politician with a higher rank, you'll find like some of them will come together, not necessarily because what they're pushing is right, or it's actually going to support the people or anything, but because they need the favor returned in one way or the other. So it's about retaining politics. And that's why you'll find that regardless of whether someone has good governance or not, they have been in power one way or the other, in one department or the other, because of that. Not necessarily because they're good leaders, not necessarily because they have actually created change for the people. And it's so unfortunate that that's the one thing that has led like, if we had good governance here in Kenya and in Africa, and maybe like all over the world, a lot of us will have solved so many of our problems. But some of our problems are actually created because of these situations, not
Uh-huh.
because it was there before, but they actually create some of these problems.
Well, we have to look at the big picture, and my belief is that if you look at human history, especially in the last several thousand years, almost all of the major wars, suppression of minorities,
Mm-hmm.
religious suppression of people who are different, has all been the result of men, decision makers, and toxic masculinity. There have been
Yeah.
some good men leaders and some good women leaders, but overall, the idea that, well, look at what Russia is doing right now in Ukraine. That's a product of toxic masculinity, the need for
Yeah.
power, the
Mm-hmm.
feeling that we can, the need to win, the need to dominate, uh,
Yeah.
the need to protect one's image. at
Mm-hmm.
all costs. Um, but many countries right now are kind of tilting back in the direction of authoritarianism. You see that in Israel and Hungary and China, as well as
Mm-hmm.
Russia and Turkey, countries like that where the there's kind of a strong man in charge, and
Mm-hmm.
the interests of the people are subordinated to the power and ego needs of that ruler. And
Yeah.
so I think in human history, we have kind of a swinging back and forth between open governments like democracies, and then on the
Mm-hmm.
other hand, dictatorships and authoritarian governments. And there's a tension between the two.
Yeah.
But the worst examples of warfare and conquest and all of those kinds of things, looking back over human history, are kind of an
Mm-hmm.
example of toxic masculinity not addressed or not contained.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing I was going to talk about at the end, but this is a good time to bring this up.
I've
One
just
other
remembered.
thing. Oh, go ahead,
I've
Evelyn.
I've just remembered something I watched today, and it was a clip of a dictator. I think he was in the military or something, and like this guy entered the submarine. I think he was being oriented by the captain of the submarine, and this guy, no, the captain told the guy is that, welcome to my submarine. There is what you've learned, there is a right way, there's a wrong way, and there's my way. And in this submarine, we do things my way. I just,
And see, can you imagine two women conducting
mhm.
that conversation that same way? It would be, it's possible, but that's such a guy thing.
Yeah,
Whose territory is this? Is this mine or is it yours? I don't
yeah.
think women generally think that way. It's our territory. We
To be honest,
cooperate.
women do draw their territories, especially when it comes to their houses. Like women draw their territories in one way or the other, and
Mhm,
actually causes a lot of fights between like in-laws and all that.
mhm.
But especially like when it comes to like dominating, like he's my son, he's my wife, like as in he's my son, he's my husband, like that. If both of you are not healthy, you would fight over such things. But if you're both healthy, you will come together and realize that you're actually supposed to work together to build up a family.
Right.
Yeah, women, I will not put it past them, quite honestly. And a lot of jealousy is experienced from women, where, like, let's say if you held a certain position, socially. For example, like, if you got a lot of attention from men, and someone attractive shows up around there, and takes away that attention away from you.
Uh-huh.
There is a lot of, yeah, it also appears in the female world. So
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that's why we said in the beginning, some of these things we characterize as masculine just because they're more typical of the way men operate, but they're toxic. Whoever does it, and women can do them too. Let
yeah.
me mention another one that I think is a toxic masculine trait, and that is the tendency to express fear as anger. I see this a lot when I work with men, not so much as with women, but the idea that when somebody's afraid or threatened, they act
Hmm.
they act out with anger, and
Hmm.
that's misleading in, let's say, a relationship
Yeah.
where they really should say to the other person, "I'm scared," or "This makes me nervous," or "I'm anxious about this," but instead they show anger, which then communicates something very different to the partner, and it's misleading and also
Yeah.
stressful. So
Yeah.
that's something we associate more with masculine, but women could do it too. Anyone who's
Hmm.
feeling more like vulnerable or afraid, but they come out as if they're angry, it's misleading, and it's not just
Yeah.
misleading to their partner; it's kind of misleading to themselves. They think the problem is I'm angry, when really the problem is I'm threatened, or I'm
Mm-hmm.
uncertain, or I'm anxious about something. Does that make
Yeah.
sense to you, Evelyn?
Yeah, it really does. And I think I've seen it a lot, especially when a man is jealous, like for example, of a position of let's say a female, and they start feeling like they need to be possessive about a situation. They're afraid to lose this position. They're afraid to lose this person. Instead of communicating how they're feeling or even address those insecurities, they end up r- rushing out and like acting in an angry manner,
Huh?
and creates a lot of chaos in the midst of it, and quite honestly maybe make themselves look bad in front of, if it's a work position, you make yourself look bad. If you're harassing the other person, you also make yourself look bad in front of the woman you're trying to like act all, this is my woman. Yeah,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
you end up looking bad, and also it also shows like you don't trust the your partner, and yeah, it makes you look bad, quite honest.
Right.
Mm,
The last three items on our list in our outline, I think we've talked about already, but just mentioning them again,
mhm,
the avoiding admitting mistakes, avoiding taking advice,
mhm.
and needing to be seen as strong and powerful. And all those, you can see, they kind of go together. I want to be
Yeah.
seen as um, perfect and in
Mhm,
control and
mhm.
trustworthy
Yeah.
and decisive, and all those things we've mentioned before. We all want these things a little bit, but if they
Yeah.
dominate our personality, then that's when they become toxic to
Mhm.
ourselves and to others.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to mention is there are a number of traits that we think of as masculine that over the generations and over the centuries have been helpful. So it's not
Yeah.
just that they're toxic. And some of these I was thinking about the other day were pride. It's to have pride in what we're doing. Uh,
Mhm.
Perseverance, to be able to persevere even though it's tough.
Yeah.
uh, Risk taking. Think of all the people who explored the world for the first time, and
Yeah.
in little boats far from home. And adventure, sense of adventure,
Mhm.
and we see these in women and men.
Mhm.
Uh, Exploration,
Mhm.
um, being tough and able to survive hardship. So there are
Mhm.
a number of traits that you could think of as masculine or feminine that
Yeah.
that are really positive, that
Mhm.
have but those, I have to say though, they're mostly positive if they're sort of balanced out by
Yeah.
other traits, and if they're done at the right time and the right place, but not just all the time.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I think that defines whether something is toxic, is
Yeah.
whether it's done overboard and all the time. If
Mhm.
it's one of our many tools that we use now and then for the right purposes, it's not toxic.
Yeah.
But and see, these are examples of characteristics that human beings have had for thousands of years that have really helped us.
Yeah.
Survival and toughness and adventure and exploring and taking risks and things like that have really allowed the human race to be as successful as we
Mhm.
have
Yeah. I think even just being brave,
been. Hmm.
and like for example, like when they are faced with problems and like there's a crisis or a challenge, a lot of men will not be moved. Like us will be, oh my god, how will we handle this? And then you,
Hmm.
it's very hard to see that in a man. He may feel it, but he, like most of the time they don't show it, and
I think
it actually,
like you mentioned, it's their ego and a question of their image.
yeah, and sometimes it's you can communicate at the right time and all that about it, but I kind of find it that they also create calmness in the situation, where as much as we're so worried, we feel confident and calm. And I do find that most of the time when people are calm, they find solutions. But if you're anxious about a situation, it's very hard for you because you're in flight mode, like you're thinking, like we're either fighting or we flight.
Right.
So it's very hard for you to come up with solutions when you're in that
Oh, yes. I
position.
think that's a very good point. Let me
Yeah.
give an example, though, of a woman's, uh, from a woman's point of view. Let's say, a woman who is facing childbirth. And so
Mhm.
she's tough and she's determined and she is fearless but let's say that same woman, and we think of that as normal and actually very healthy, and it allows her to get through that very painful experience of childbirth. But what if that woman showed those qualities all the time in all parts of her life? She never asked for help. She never showed any weakness. She never showed fear. She never let people know she was vulnerable. Well, then it wouldn't be good. So
Yeah.
some of these traits, it's the question of using them in the right amount, at the right time, and the right place.
Yeah. It's really, really important to have a balanced life. I think it's just like food. Let's say food, for example. When you're hungry, you're supposed to eat, and you're supposed to eat with moderation. If you overeat, you end up having a hurting tummy. So it is important to have a balanced life and act in a balanced way. Be considerate of other people in every situation. As much as you're also taking risks, also ensure that you do not go overboard about it and put other people in danger and all that. And as much as, yeah, you are thinking you're brave and you want to face your problems head on, sometimes retrieving or just backing down about a situation is way more healthier than going face first
Mhm.
about a situation.
If you look at history, I mean, there are a number of examples of explorers who, at a certain point, problems came up in their expedition, and they, instead of falling back and regrouping, getting more information, waiting for help, they went ahead, and then they faced disaster. Or there are stories in history in our country of military leaders like General Custer, who went off
Mhm,
to attack the Indians with
mhm,
and he ignored warning signs, and eventually his whole company was massacred. So I think,
mhm.
Evelyn, what you're saying, and we see it even now, like what Putin is doing in Ukraine. I mean,
Mhm,
it's not smart. It's
mhm.
driven by some need for power, and it could result in, and I think it already is resulting in disaster and
Yeah.
tragedy for the Russian soldiers and the Russian society. So your point's really good. If we plow
And
it and not ask for help or use resources, yeah, that's not smart. Bad
yeah,
things can happen.
yeah, it's not. Sometimes you can be faced by a challenge, and your first instinct is to, fight back and try and protect what you have and all that. But some of these challenges are here to teach us, and you're supposed to learn from them. And
Mhm.
maybe it's a warning sign from something you didn't see coming. So sometimes when you take a step back and you calm yourself down, look at the situation well, and then you act afterwards, you will end up coming up with a wise decision on how to deal with the situation other than what you're normally used to doing. And maybe you'll even come up with a better plan than you would have going face on, because you want to put up the face that I'm a fighter, I can do this. You know what? You can't come and take my things.
In these days, I've done a lot of training of police officers, and what we tell them now is the strong officer asks for help when needed. In the
Mhm.
old days, the strong police officer did not ask for help, did it himself.
Yeah.
I had a man, a client a few years ago who was in his middle age, and in the
Mhm.
middle of one of our sessions, he interrupted me and he said, "Wait a minute, doctor. Are you telling me that if I have a feeling of some sort, like an emotion, that I should actually tell that to some other person?" It was like it was dawning on him for the first time that that would be an option, that I
Wow.
express my feeling to someone
Yeah.
else. And I laughed and said, "Yes, that's what I'm telling you."
That is so sad. That is so sad. I
Hmm.
think that is sad. And it's so unfortunate that a lot of men feel they don't even know that they can ask for help. They don't even know that you can actually sit down with your partner and discuss
And
whatever
we
is
think of
going
this as we think of this as a masculine trait, and it's sort of stereotypically is. But I've had
Yeah.
many women clients who are in a situation that's very tough, and they're trying to go it alone and not ask for help. So we, any one of us, can do it, but
Yeah.
it's not healthy when we do it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, in moderation, a little bit of self-reliance and
Mm-hmm.
determination and perseverance is a good thing. So just like a lot of things, some of these traits are good in small amounts or in moderation.
Can I think I think it's a lot of work. Let me just tell you maybe like how I because I think I've also found myself in that situation, and I think it's a lot of work, especially as a perfectionist. Like it's a lot of work to come and communicate how you feel or how you'd like someone to help you,
Mhm.
and they end up trying to change your entire plan, and or even maybe they don't understand you, and or maybe you have an expectation of how you want them to behave or act,
Yeah.
then they don't do it, or even the whole process of talking about it, especially
I,
when you want the solution immediately. I think that is one of the things that maybe makes them not want to communicate at
oh
that
yes.
point.
And many people in that situation have maybe tried to reach out and they got a very bad response, so they stop. That's really true. This relates to one of our other programs about toxic relationships, and that is when you really do open up and you make yourself vulnerable to someone else and they don't listen and they don't hear you, and they either take over or they ignore you or they trivialize what you're any of those things, then that's a toxic relationship for you and one we need to get out of and find another person. So
Mm.
yes, you're right, you may not always get it's
Sometimes
not
it's not
you have to
necessarily.
always get these that you'll get understood.
Yeah. I'm saying sometimes it's not necessarily because they don't want to listen. It could be like a different perspective of the situation. And sometimes we don't have the patience to explain it again and again until the person tries and understands. Because sometimes not everyone will just understand it immediately. And I
I would,
think,
I would have to say though that not listening initially is really a more of a kind of a typically masculine, toxic masculine kind of trait that when I've trained psychologists over the years, the
Mhm.
listening part is the women that I've trained get that much easier and much more naturally sometimes than the men that I've trained. The men can
Mhm.
get it and can develop the ability to listen and be patient, but it's a little harder for them because in among men, if a man is telling another man about a problem, as soon as the other man thinks he knows a solution, he's supposed to interrupt and give the solution. And that is not really how normally women interact. And so
Yeah.
over the years training men psychologists, they've had a little more trouble by and large just listening longer, listening deeper,
Yeah.
not coming up with your own ideas too quickly. Same thing with leaders of companies that I've worked with. As I mentioned earlier, that a good tactic for leaders of companies is to really gather other people's input and make it, instead of just saying what they think all the time.
Yeah.
Anyway, this has been a really good discussion, Evelyn.
Yeah, it has been. It really has been. Oh, sorry about that. Um, sorry. I don't know what I'm trying to do.
We're almost at the end anyway. Well, I think we actually have gone over. So let's look forward to our next meeting
Yeah.
on toxic femininity, and see what everybody thinks, and see if anybody has questions between.
Yeah. This has been an amazing topic, and I am so glad we discussed it. And I'm so looking forward to our next topic, which is toxic femininity. And I think we should, I don't know, give them like a little bit of a tip of what we'll be talking about, and then as we wish them goodbye.
Well, of course, one trait that comes to my mind right away would be putting other people's needs and ideas ahead of your own. You
Yeah.
know, it seems like that's a nice thing to do, but done
Yeah.
to an extreme, it's toxic to both
Mhm.
parties. Anyway, we'll
Yeah.
talk about it. Anyway,
Yeah. Looking forward to it, guys. Thank you so much for
thanks
everything, for
everybody.
listening.
Thanks
Yeah.
everybody for attending.
Yeah. We hope that you can share this discussion with your friends and keep watching the previous videos. You will understand some of the things we were discussing today that way. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day. Good night.